Hello, everybody. It is my great privilege to be in the midst of so many of you arts education practitioners from all over the continent and beyond. And I'm glad that I too can participate in this inaugural conference. It is encouraging to note the theme of the conference that as a continent, we want to embrace indigenous knowledge, and not just in any form or in any way, but through arts education, and not just embracing indigenous knowledge through arts education, but for a very particular purpose, for sustainable development goals. We do know that world over, governments, civil society, non-government organizations are grappling with ways in which the people that they work with and the people that they work around can achieve some of these sustainable development goals. And I think it is really encouraging to note that as arts education practitioners and as this global association, we are also considering where we fit in not just as arts educators, but where we fit in perhaps as people from Africa with a very particular way of seeing things, a very particular way of doing things, our indigenous knowledge system. It is a joy for me to be with you. Allow me to share my screen just so that I can perhaps be a little coherent. It is easy to lose track of what one wants to say, and I am glad this is here as a guide just to keep me in track. So I have just carved a little sentence or a clause from the general title of the conference. And I just want us to interrogate briefly, perhaps conceptual issues around indigenous knowledge through the arts for sustainable development goals. And of course, it won't just be through the arts, but through arts education. I have been asked to focus a little more on music education, which to me may not be too hard because that's probably the only thing I try to know a little bit about. My name is Emily Achieng Akuno. I am a professor of music of the Technical University of Kenya. Currently, I serve as the Deputy Vice Chancellor in charge of academic affairs at the Cooperative University of Kenya. I have also been privileged in the past few months to be the president of the International Society for Music Education, a privilege that I really owe not only to the people, the members of ISME from the continent of Africa, but to those other members of ISME from other parts of the world who have really mentored me, who have stretched a hand, shall I call it a hand of fellowship, a hand of partnership, so that we have been able to work together on projects, develop papers together, and thereby grow within this context of global music education. Thank you very much. I also want to thank the organizers of this conference for letting me be part of it. But most of all, and let us be indigenous about this, we always want to thank those who went before us, those who started this journey of contemplating the arts, contemplating culture, contemplating issues of education, arts education, research, etc. Those who created a path for us to follow, but also those who raised questions, the questions that now challenge our beliefs, the questions that shake our confidence, the questions that send us back to the field to collect data, the questions that take us back to the classroom to ask the students what they asked the last time that we were with them, because that is how we learn, and that is how our industry and our sector of education grows. Thank you very much. So what are the presenting really, just tackling some conceptual matters on arts and particularly on music education, so that we see if and or how we can assist our governments, our people to attain the SDGs. So the question is, how do the arts and artists, how does music and the musicians feature in the attainment of the SDGs? How do arts education and training contribute to this scenario? And when we think of education, do we include indigenous knowledge and do we include indigenous expressions in our reckoning of arts education, in our reckoning of music education, as we endeavor to contribute to the SDGs? And then what are the key issues that education and practice must contemplate towards a successful program of embracing indigenous knowledge for the SDGs? That is kind of what I want to consider. We come then to the arts. What are these? Are they distinct contents like sculpture, painting, film, song, dance? Or are they contexts, the space for engagement with particular activities? Or are they processes, ways of doing things, activities? Or are they all of the above? When we talk of the arts today, do we conceive of them as including our indigenous cultural expressions? Do we find in the arts elements of indigenous knowledge? Do they serve the same role that our indigenous expressions, our cultural expressions, have served in our indigenous economy from centuries back? What is the nature of art? In our global villages, are there arts that can be said to be African, European, etc. in this day and age? What is it that gives these arts an identity? Maybe I'm not going to answer any of those questions, but I think it is important for us to consider them, especially for those of us who engage in the practices and the processes of imparting knowledge, of shaping ideas, of charting ways for creativity. My next question is around the creative industries, and I think about the creative industries because when we think of SDGs, we start thinking of things that are done, things that are generated. And here's my question around the arts and indigenous knowledge with respect to the creative industries. What do we think of our indigenous or our cultural arts in the context of the creative industry? Do we have space for them? What do we consider as crucial elements for a successful creative industry? Where does music come in? And which kind of music? And with that, I cannot help but think about the role of the arts in industry. My take is that this should not be restricted to aesthetics, but it should include concepts and processes. And so concepts like design thinking and recently arts research, so that the arts present a way of doing things, of conceptualizing things, as well as ways of presenting things. Let me talk briefly about the space that I find myself in, gratefully, Kenya. Our informal sector and the place of the creatives in this sector. The creatives, with the industry having been left to flounder on its own quite some time back, the industry, the creatives call themselves hustlers or informal entrepreneurs. Some of them take creative activities as side hustles. And so teachers of the arts are always confronted by parents who want to know what the real job of their children would be. Those who study music and who practice music, especially young people, probably have peers who ask them, but seriously, what do you really do? With this attitude, we cannot be expected to make any contribution to the SDGs, can we? I dare say yes, we can. Because there's certain things that seem to work for the youth, but how about the elderly, those who are more likely to be custodians of the indigenous culture? Does our economy, does our system, especially our educational system, have space for them, have space for the culture bearers within the education space, so that we end up ensuring that indigenous knowledge is contributing to the achievement of the sustainable development goals? A short while back, I was in a virtual gathering. Sounds wrong, but it was a platform, a discussion platform, where one of the renowned artists from Kenya indicated that in Kenya, music is now going away from the informal sector. It is moving away from the informal sector. And really, the evidence given was the fact that musicians are now being taxed. And I'm asking myself, we, the educators, the academy, is there something that we could have done to move music from the informal sector? Is there a way that education and training could have worked on this content or body of knowledge or area of knowledge to make sure that the discipline or the industry or the workers, the players in the industry, are not considered as being informal entrepreneurs, but we make that segment of the industry a lot more formal, a lot more, and formal is not in a negative way, but perhaps a lot more lucrative. Because I have a feeling that that might be a way in which we would be recognized as contributing realistically to the realization of the SDGs. The need to professionalize the sector, the music sector, the creative industry sector, is something that has been voiced in many fora. And I cannot overemphasize the role of education, training, and tooling in enabling this professionalization. But I really think that there may be something gagging the academy. There is government goodwill, there's government purpose, and maybe these are absent, these are needed. And perhaps if they are not there, maybe that could be part of our key to music and music education impacting on SDGs. Besides, matters of cultural relevance in music education is really a perennial challenge. How can music education and cultural relevance be positioned to ensure that there is a strong role for indigenous knowledge in the attainment of the SDGs? And here they are, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, voiced and usually interpreted in ways that seem at times to point to particular sectors of the economy. But when you look at them carefully, even for us, there is at least something that we can contribute to directly. Look at number one. When we want to eradicate poverty, that of course talks to job creation. Can the indigenous knowledge be worked on can we work with it in arts education, in music education, so that we generate the kind of wealth or enhance people's ways of living so that we eradicate poverty? So some of these have particular focus, but some, maybe there's some that we can personally identify with. Look at number 4, the quality of education. Perhaps I'll mention something a little about that. Is there space for indigenous knowledge? through the arts in these 17. And perhaps the question that I'm asking is, what is our scorecard as arts educators? As individual countries, as a continent, where are we in the attainment of these SDGs? Which of us who are seated in this gathering recognizes that what we do must, can, and should have an impact on our country's achievement of the SDGs? Perhaps another question, how do we contribute to the achievement? How do we perform these SDGs within the context of music, of arts education? And I think that the SDGs might just offer us avenues that we had not thought about. If we look at the fourth one, which is talking about access to education, we probably want to remember that there are people who may not have attained the levels of education that they are at or that they have attained had it not been for the music talent, the art talent that they have. And I have particular examples from Kenya that I'm not really going to mention right now. But one that comes to my mind so clearly is at an annual music festival where a young man, a young boy, barely 14 years of age, beautifully and successfully conducted an unaccompanied rendition of Handel's The Hallelujah Chorus from the Messiah. And I could see from the around the table of the dignitaries in the room that there was much consultation, much whispering happening. And at the end of the day, there was an announcement from a senior education officer to the effect that that young man who had conducted was now going to go to high school. The young man had sat his primary school, his elementary school examinations the previous year and had scored very good marks, but his parents did not have money to take him to secondary school. And so word got round that he was actually repeating primary school so that he could stay in education, because primary school education was almost free. And money was raised, a scholarship was found, and he went to school. I'm sure in your own spaces, examples abound where music, that talent, has enabled one to attain quality education. So as individuals, what is our scorecard? But we also think about the curriculum, music in education, and we ask ourselves, what might be new? And sometimes when we talk about music in the curriculum, maybe we're thinking about performance and activities that have to do with aesthetics. And maybe we're just thinking of aesthetics as the only focus and end of music education. And my question is there room for us to manipulate this subject of music of the arts to ensure that music or arts-sensed concepts and conceptualization processes are available for the broader human experience and other professions? In short, can the aims of music and arts education move beyond enabling the learner to engage with the aesthetic product or the aesthetic process? Or do we find that notion offensive as arts educators? Do we perceive music and arts education only as leading to performance, to composition? Are music and arts graduates not capable of other engagements? Maybe that's what disables us from thinking of how to contribute to or drive the SDGs. What is the music, what is the creative industry value chain? And who fulfills the roles in these value chains, if not the person who has been music educated, who has been art educated? Sometimes, like in my environment, we talk about self-trained or self-styled or briefcase artpreneurs. My question is, where do they get their business? I think they have noted a gap somewhere in the value chain, and trained or not trained musically or artistically, they fill that gap. And I wonder if we cannot logically capture these and legitimize them as careers for which music and arts can train. Why don't we train for the full value chain? Might that make it easier for us to engage in the attainment of the SDGs? A little bit of history, and this might help us to get a perspective with respect to the indigenous knowledge system or indigenous knowledge within our arts education space right now. The story of formal arts and formal music education in Kenya, I think, is very similar to that of other African countries. In Kenya, higher music education starts in around 1965 when a music department was opened at Kenyatta College. And this Kenyatta College was really being established some 2 or 3 very short years after independence. The aim was to produce teachers for the expected growth of secondary school education. Now, the aim of that institution drove what graduates the institution was producing and ultimately drove the content of their training. So for 34 years, the only programs that were offered locally to Kenyans who wanted to get into post-secondary music studies, the only programs were in education. In 1999, at Kenyatta University, which was now what had been Kenyatta College, developed, and I dare say out of sheer obstinacy, the Bachelor of Arts and the Bachelor of Music programs, and therefore ushered in the diversity that has now expanded and grown. In the year 2000 then, two new programs were launched, and that broke the monopoly of the Bachelor of Education Arts as the qualification for university level music study in Kenya. Though at that time, the master's degree was already on offer, it attracted Bachelor of Education holders. So their orientation, their thinking was really towards educational concepts and research. And so this really was to be expected. But from then, it was all upwards. The door had been opened. So other institutions came up and started developing their own programs, though some, of course, replicated what Kenyatta University was offering. But we note that from as late or as early as 1979, there was a lament that indigenous forms of music knowledge were not adequately represented in the curriculum, whether by way of content or by way of process of teaching and learning. And that means that the concepts could not really be adequately covered. So what I am leading to is that for us to ensure that indigenous knowledge is so much part of arts education, perhaps, and practice, that they contribute to the SDGs, we need to have an expanded concept of a number of things. We know that we cannot teach what we cannot conceptualize. I mean, if you can't imagine something, if you can't define, if you can't articulate something, you really cannot teach it. So when do we extend our curriculum offerings to cover the various things that one does with the arts, to cover, for example, conceptualization, crafting, designing, production, packaging, merchandising, legislation, enforcement, licensing, training, educating, tooling, technology, replication, duplication, marketing, regulation, quality control, financing, policy development, researching, archiving, etc., so that we give an artistic orientation to learners in the creative field. Another question, perhaps decolonization could come to our rescue as we work towards incorporating indigenous knowledge in our music class towards the attainment of the SDGs. We clearly need principles and guidelines. We need modes of actualizing this so that we bring sense to our efforts. This then expands the notion of music education from the perhaps myopic perception of talent education to equipping an individual to work with music contexts, music concepts, skills, and tools in performing a variety of tasks within the arena of sustainable development. Further, embedding the cultural art forms, the indigenous art forms into the curriculum is going to be very crucial for both educational relevance and for sustaining our cultural heritage, which is the rich source of information and practice. This then leads us to consider art as both the process and the product of something that is done by an artist. In short, an artist is someone who does art. So since I am an artist, then whatever it is that I'm doing, wherever I am, should be art. Take that with a grain of salt. A little bit about sustainable development. The concept of sustainability speaks to more than the environment. At the individual level, perhaps it is about developing other avenues of engaging when the current working situation changes so that the livelihood is maintained. And the disruption of COVID-19, I think, has taught us this seriously. It also speaks to an intellectual and emotional grounding that generates ideas and programs to support development activities. Sustainability is possible with a move towards multidisciplinary learning, with tailor-made programs to tool the individual to serve a variety of roles so that there isn't a fixed target, because the target is moving. Remember, culture is dynamic. The economy is not static. It is ever shifting. So knowledge economy at some point in which the creative economy snugly fits. Society is dynamic. There's much movement with rapid changes in technology, which means that the form of the art product as merchandise is pretty much unpredictable. The market changes. Both the space for or the platform of its exchange and of its consumption, as well as the population that is accessing and asking for it. We know that at the moment, the young people dictate pretty much the taste or the forms of art that are in the market. But we still have a very specialized, collections. There are still clients for whom specific forms, specific formats are lucrative. This is the community that may be useful in enhancing the uptake of indigenous knowledge generated art forms. So this transforming nature of the market demands sensitivity and quick response. If it were possible, perhaps a proactive approach or maybe a predictive attitude to curriculum development. When in Kenya, the Teacher Service Commission did not have any more vacancies for music teachers, the graduates of our programs had to find somewhere else to fit. Those who could moved from becoming teachers into becoming players in the entertainment sector. However, their training was not always geared in that way. Their training was not towards the entertainment sector, but more towards education. So many graduates have had to improvise or choose to veer in that direction during their co-curricular engagements and activities when they were undertaking their training. And so upon graduation, they could fit in snugly. Today's industry in Kenya has more roles than education. And music technology, for one, has really picked up. It is grasped by many entities who offer training really to fit into the programs that they have. The definition of the industry and SDGs has not adequately embraced indigenous knowledge and art forms within Kenya. The freeing of the airwaves, which calls for local content, has expanded the nation's appetite for locally generated music. And so this market continues to lure many youth into being artists without very obvious attention to systematic training. When these artists embrace the elements of cultural expression, it is often a superimposition of this cultural information onto what they have assimilated through mass media. There is a need for some syncretic treatment and ways of showing an informed process of creating works that are acceptable in the industry with a distinct relationship to indigenous forms. And this is stronger now than ever. What scope is there for the academy in this regard? Meanwhile, traditional music continues to thrive, perhaps with a certain generation. And this also happens for specific functions. For example, in weddings, we tend to see people running to the rural regions to bring a performing troupe that comes in from a designated ethnic community to provide a cultural element to the wedding event. This really is not sustainable because it is not the best way of applying and sustaining our indigenous art forms. This sporadic foraging in the culture closet does not lend itself to a good reception and intentional engagement and development towards sustainability. And so the nature of the society demands a the nature of the society demands a common understanding of sustainable development. Where does it happen and who performs it? The performance of sustainable development happens, in my view, on two stages interdependently: the teaching and practice spaces. The first stage is the community. The community provides space for conceptualization, where we develop, the conceptualization of development and sustainability, which results in preparing profiles of the development and sustainability tasks. This requires some analytical and perceptual skills. This requires creative skills, and this requires also presentation skills. There are these are some of the skills that are developed through music study. It is also space for the preparation of players. In short, the tooling of individuals to fit the roles in the conceptualized tasks. It is also the space for engagement or for collaboration with communities. And this is where the needs of the community are deciphered. The second space is the academy. We task the school to bring up useful citizens, often with no clear indication of the boundaries, shapes, and sizes of useful. The focus of this conference being the application of indigenous knowledge requires that useful includes indigenous knowledge in its definition. Are we looking for a person who is grounded in their cultural expressions, who will use this as their primary mode of expression, their worldview, their perception, their way of understanding, and their way of expression? That is a point to consider. The academy speaks to formal instruction in organized space, following a tailored set of objectives in a set timeline. But there is a wider classroom, the class of life and society. This opens eyes and, to the creative, provides inspiration. Music education guides this kind of learning even within the academy, and hence its significance as a space for holistic education. This is demonstrated in our music material with content and processes that are an education package. How then do we develop music as a tool for engaging in sustainable development? I think it is important to note that music is both a form of knowledge and a way of knowing. We're really talking about content and process. We also would wish to realize that when we develop the artist, we develop the art. Why? When the artist's skills are enhanced, the product will be enhanced. We also want to note that if you want good music, you will need to have good musicians, because the quality of the product hinges on the quality of the producer and the quality of the processes of its production, which really amount to the knowledge and skills of the producing agent. The conference theme calls for us to embrace indigenous knowledge through the arts. The crux of the matter really is in terms of the process and product of these arts. Tooling the artist results in well-tooled works. Well-tooled works that will fetch economic rewards for the artist, therefore contributing to the attainment of the SDGs. Can we tool our indigenous musicians, those elders who are custodians of indigenous knowledge, to produce works of value in the contemporary economy? So the question is, where to with education and training? We need to tool the industry. What types of players are there in the industry? Which ones do we need? The overall nature of useful players needs to be a mix of thinkers and doers, planners and practitioners. In this mix, we have the analysts, those who engage with music as a phenomenon towards generating ways of understanding its status, understanding its content, for application in meaningful and beneficial ways to humanity. So these are the researchers, the thinkers in the discipline, the scientists, etc. But it also has P, the planners, those who will be policymakers, the development actors. These are the designers, the technocrats. And then we have I, the implementers, those who engage with the profession at application level. This is the interface with humanity, with society, and all that they contain, i.e., the interface with culture. These are the creatives with a technical manipulation know-how. A mix of thinking and doing is useful, but there are varying degrees and quantities of each in the tooling of the different levels of industry players, which results in doing thinkers and thinking doers. So, what content are we talking about? The concepts, the symbols, the idioms, the relations, the processes. Remember that we always teach, we provide knowledge, but we tend to leave the learners free to use that knowledge in context of their choice or at their disposition. Might we perhaps need to sculpture the content for specific spaces of the industry or for specific sectors of the value chain? What indigenous knowledge content is no longer valuable, if any? Which curriculum do we retain? And how do we decide what to teach? Perhaps we want to look at the sector. We want to decipher what activities and responsibilities exist in the sector. We also want to look at associated sectors and decipher what added value indigenous music knowledge and skills might be to those associated sectors. Perhaps that is where we'll be considering music as an enabler, for example, in publishing, in research and dissemination. And that is where multidisciplinarity really comes in broadcasting, archiving, hospitality, tourism, for the entertainment element, but also look at remote sectors. And we see how music provides knowledge that will enhance their performance, or knowledge that will give them a humane status, social work, community development work, etc., so that they are given an understanding of how humans behave in the community and how they express themselves. The other question is what skills, the hows and how-tos of music. The skills to use the knowledge above in various, perhaps unrelated contexts and fields. A question that I keep asking myself, and maybe it's time I went to find out, Does NASA, the American agency, does it employ music graduates? I wonder. Does Walt Disney employ a music graduate? I think many. Does the office of the president of your country employ a music graduate, not as a court musician, but as a strategist? Why not? Do we not include strategic thinking and operational skills in our teaching? Are these not significant opportunities to which music-based knowledge and skills can facilitate access? I know I'm being radical. The other what is on technologies, broadly stated as the tools, the equipment, the technical abilities, not just for the cultural sector, but designs that are informed by music concepts and concepts that are developed from engaging with indigenous knowledge and music resources. My last what is the attitudes. That disposition, cultural intelligence, resilience, adaptability, respect, etc. What we need for critical engagement with issues, patience, perseverance, stamina, resilience, focus, adaptability, these things that are developed through engagement with music. The second question is who? Who teaches and who is taught? I believe that the best person to teach is one who has a personal reason, an intrinsic motivation to learn. This is the person who will, in the end, develop their own personal philosophy for the discipline. And who teaches? There's a saying that if you can't, teach. If you cannot perform, teach. I think differently, and this is something that I've gathered from just observation. I think the best performer composer should be the teacher. I think you can identify with that, or rather, I hope you can identify with that. As I come towards conclusion, there are typical scenarios that therefore call for enacting laws and practices that enable artists' intervention for sustainable development goals. We start with policies. What are the existing ones? How do they inculcate a sense of responsibility, ownership, and freedom to explore, to create, and to reap from our labors? Second, we have regulatory bodies. What do they do to empower the individual while maintaining a sense of African identity in our arts, while as yet positioning us globally? We have guilds. Do we have any that enable us to be professional and responsive to global trends while remaining rooted in the local cultural resource space? Professional associations, these are checks and balances. They allow the members to be their brother's keepers. They are also formidable advocacy and lobbying platforms for the disciplines and related professions. They have ways of controlling jealousies, partisan politics, etc., etc. We need them. It is often useful to have some small, specific, focused groupings and a larger umbrella body that sees to the professional conduct of members and the contribution to the national development debate, including the setting up of fees by members of the various disciplines. Have we professionalized arts education and arts practice in this regard? To answer these questions, it is likely that existing policies are not perhaps specific to arts education, maybe not in all the countries. We might have some policies that have an element of arts education in them. Sub-Saharan Africa has a number of music-related society, and sometimes they overlap, they have overlapping mandates. I am reminded of two umbrella regional organizations, the African Music Council, AMC, and the Pan-African Society for Musical Arts Education. These are regional board organs of the International Music Council and the International Society for Music Education, respectively. But is there a body that regulates what goes on into the training of the music practitioner? How do the two entities regard the practice of music education, the regulation of standards, and the quality of music product? And how do they ensure fair play? good remuneration for the creatives, thereby helping us to eradicate the exploitation and harassment of artists, thereby helping us to achieve Sustainable Development Goal number 1? These are questions that one asks and analyzes and wants to get responses to. What is the starting point? I think we start with policy. The articulation of commitment, which is then also a basis for planning. What does the policy address? The concept of performing arts, the concept of sustainable development within the context of performing arts, and the concept of performing arts for sustainable development. It also articulates the commitment of governments to developing, to supporting the industry or the sector. It also articulates the structures that are in place to enact legislation and or regulations to support and or institute performing arts practices and education as an avenue to meeting the SDGs. But I think of great significance is that it articulates the scope of this whole program called Indigenous Music or Creative Arts or Performing Arts for Sustainable Development, that it is important to articulate that scope. Otherwise, we might be too narrow or we might bite something that is too big for us to chew. But it also articulates strategies. The strategies for activating the structures that we've mentioned above, which includes tooling the population, resource identification, mobilization, and harnessing. And it articulates strategies for positioning music and music education, or generally arts and arts education for sustainable development. But I think finally, the policy does indicate who is responsible for doing what, the office that is responsible for implementation. Allow me to conclude. How do we embrace Indigenous knowledge through the arts for sustainable development goals? I think the first thing we do is to develop relevant policies. We also reconceptualize education and arts education for that matter, so that Indigenous knowledge is embedded in it, or perhaps provides the definition, provides the concept, provides the content, provides the processes. We also need to recognize Indigenous knowledge as a component of the arts, the music profession. We need to connect practice to teaching and learning so that we tool the role players within the profession. We need to set and maintain standards to regulate the practice and training. We also need to enact relevant regulations to implement the policies and activities for maintaining standards. We need to engage and recognize the best performers as appropriate players in all sectors of the economy. In short, we need to professionalize music practice and education at all levels. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that I have said something that makes sense, and especially when we look at this broad topic. I know that in the next couple of days, there are going to be very specific presentations that are going to unpack, let me stop sharing, that are going to unpack the various concepts that are embedded in the theme of the conference. And I know there are very well-researched speakers, people whose lifetime's work has been dedicated to various issues around arts education, around sustainable development goals, and also around Indigenous knowledge. My take has really been just briefly to try and raise questions, to try and expose my concerns, my dilemmas, to try perhaps and think aloud as to what, as a continent, we could be doing to ensure that as arts educators and the products of our education endeavor, as a collective, we too can be counted. We too can contribute to the attainment of to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. May I, at this moment, therefore, wish you a very, very successful conference. I know I'll be hearing a lot more in the next, as the time goes on. Thank you so much for listening, and bye for now.